So last video, I wrapped up talking about some of the key elements of the scientific method, skepticism, empiricism, verification, falsifiability, control, and peer review. And now I want to talk about some of the goals of the scientific method. So by accumulating this knowledge, what are we trying to do? These four goals are description, prediction, explanation, and application. And they kind of are ascending in order of complexity and just how you're trying to use this information, I guess, and ascending in specificity, we could say too. So, what are description and prediction to start off? Description is just what it sounds like, that you're trying to describe something. You're defining, classifying, cataloging, or categorizing things and how they're related in psychology to talk about mental processes and behaviors. So, if you were just talking about how often people get married, or how often people get hired in a job, or looking at the demographic characteristics of a population, like in the U.S. Census, for example, those would all be examples of description. So it's important in a lot of contexts just to know how often something happens or how many people with a certain characteristic there are. Some differences here in types of description. Nomothetic versus idiographic basically means groups versus individuals. So nomothetic, are you describing groups, like let's say with a census, or idiographic, are you describing the behavior of, let's say, one patient in a case study or something like that. Another distinction that's useful, but a little bit different, quantitative versus qualitative. Quantitative just means using numbers. Qualitative means using words very broadly. So studies that have a lot of statistical analysis are going to tend to be quantitative. Studies that have to do with, like, case studies, like I've mentioned, describing an event or a person, those are going to be more qualitative. So nomothetic studies do have a tendency to be quantitative, and idiographic studies do have a tendency to be qualitative, but those are different distinctions, and it's not always the case that they fall into one or the other bucket there. Okay, so that's description. Prediction has to do with actually being able to you'll notice in this class I sometimes have to struggle to come up with synonyms for different things, like prediction. But if you're trying to guess or estimate whether something is going to happen based on something else, obviously that's prediction. So trying to predict somebody's behavior based on their personality characteristics or based on the situation they find themselves in, that might be prediction. So looking at whether using census data, for example, to predict where more services are going to be needed based on the ages of people in a particular area, for example. Or do we need to shift resources toward more elder care in cities and regions that have an older population, for example? That might be a way to use prediction. There are different methods we might use to do predictions. Correlation is something that we'll talk about at length in the future, but it just is the relationship between usually two different variables. Do they both go up? Does one go up and the other goes down? Do they both go down? That sort of thing. Regression is a little more complicated. We'll allude to it a little bit, but it's not going to be a major part of this class. Regression is basically using more than one variable to predict another one, and then you can reduce the impact of other variables in that equation. So maybe you take all of the things that you measure in census data, like ethnicity, age, region, whether people have children, whether they're married. Maybe you take all of those variables in order to predict some kind of outcome, rather than just looking at only how age impacts something. So prediction can, be with just two variables, x and y, or it can be how, A, B, C, D, E, and F predict y, for example, with regression. The next thing I wanted to mention was explanation. So it's one thing to just describe something or just predict it, but then how to actually explain how or why something is happening is a little more complicated. So it's easy sometimes to know, well, if X happens, Y is going to happen. That would be prediction. But why does X lead to Y? What is the mechanism? What is the underlying process that is leading some particular personality trait to impact people's behavior? So rather than just looking at a relationship, people are trying to explore the causes of things with explanation. Why exactly does variable X lead to variable Y? The major way that people do this is by using the method that we'll talk the most about this semester, experiments. And we'll get to the logic of that in a bit, but experiments are really one of the only ways, and often the best way, that you can look at causal relationships rather than just correlational relationships. It's also important, though, to note whenever you're trying to explain something, whether your results generalize. So if you're studying, let's say, just a group of Hamlin students, that is a useful population for lots of research questions. But if you notice some particular pattern of behavior in Hamlin students, is that necessarily going to be the case for students at the University of Minnesota or students at the University of Florida, or, let's say an elderly population in Poland, right? One thing that you observe in a particular group doesn't necessarily generalize to every other group. So you need to be careful with the scope of your explanations, even after you have some kind of evidence for them. So in order to actually talk about the cause of a behavior, you have to meet these different conditions for experimentation. That you have temporal precedence, which is just a fancy way of saying the cause comes before the outcome. X comes before Y. You can't say that X causes Y if they happen at the same time, or if Y comes before X, right? Covariation of cause and effect. You need to see consistently that X leads to Y. And if it's not consistent, you need to look at the reasons why it might only happen sometimes. So the cause and effect need to co-occur or co-vary. And you need to be able to eliminate alternative explanations. Like, is there something besides X that is causing Y? And if you can reach all three of these conditions, then you can make a good argument for why X might be causing Y. Okay, so the last goal of the scientific method that I'll mention here is application. Application is having an understanding of, how to describe something, how to predict the relationships between things, understanding what those relationships mean, but taking all that information and actually using it. So you can use description, prediction, and explanation, let's say, just to publish articles and describe how the human mind works, or whatever your area of study happens to be. But applied research is separate from that sort of basic kind of research in a way. Applied research is actually using that information that we're accumulating as a science to improve people's lives, or make suggestions about policy or something like that. So there's this distinction between basic and applied research that has been, present since people started doing research. And applied research has often gotten kind of a bad reputation as, like, if you can't contribute something novel through basic research, well, you can just take someone else's ideas and apply them to the real world, which is a pretty dismissive and unconstructive way of making that distinction. And applied research oftentimes is more difficult and more time consuming than basic research. So it absolutely, deserves its due as well. Okay, I'm gonna stop with those goals and go on to the next video to talk about how we actually conduct science.